Today marks a critical deadline in a battle between the White House and America's most treasured cultural institution, the Smithsonian Institution, home to the Hope Diamond, the Wright brothers plane, and the original Star-Spangled Banner, now finds itself at the center of an unprecedented political firestorm. With billions of dollars in federal funding hanging in the balance and the integrity of historical truth at stake, this is a story about power, independence, and who gets to tell America's story. What is the Smithsonian? Before we dive into today's controversy, let's establish what's actually at risk here. The Smithsonian Institution isn't just another government agency. Created by Congress in 1846, it operates as what's called an independent trust instrumentality, a unique public-private partnership that was specifically designed to remain at arm's length from political interference. The institution manages 21 museums, 21 libraries, the National Zoo, and numerous research centers, primarily in Washington, D.C. Last year alone, nearly 17 million people walked through its doors, most paying nothing for admission. Its billion-dollar annual budget comes from two sources, about two-thirds from federal appropriations controlled by Congress, and the rest from private donations. Its endowment and revenue from museum shops and other sources. Here's the crucial detail. According to its charter, the Smithsonian's museums and research centers are meant to be run independently of the federal government. It's overseen by a board of regents that includes the vice president, the chief justice of the Supreme Court, members of Congress, and 9 citizens. This structure was intentionally designed to protect it from the very thing now happening: political control over how history is presented. The current conflict began on March 27, 2025, when President Trump signed Executive Order 14253, titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. The order makes serious accusations, claiming the Smithsonian has fallen under the influence of what it calls divisive, race-centered ideology that portrays American and Western values as inherently harmful and oppressive. The order specifically tasks Vice President J.D. Vance, who serves on the Smithsonian's Board of Regents, with removing what it terms improper ideology from all areas of the institution. It directs the Office of Management and Budget to ensure that future appropriations prohibit spending on exhibits or programs that allegedly degrade shared American values, divide Americans based on race, or promote programs inconsistent with federal law and policy. President Trump has been vocal about his concerns. In August, he posted on social media that the Smithsonian was out of control, claiming that everything discussed is how horrible our country is, how bad slavery was, and how unaccomplished the downtrodden have been, with nothing about success, brightness, or the future. The White House followed up in August with a letter demanding what they called a comprehensive internal review of 8 museums: the National Museum of American History, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the National Air and Space Museum, the National Museum of the American Indian, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the National Portrait Gallery, the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, and the National Museum of Natural History. What exactly did they request? The White House demanded gallery labels, future exhibition plans, internal communications about artwork selection, organizational charts, curatorial manuals, proposals for future exhibitions, and guidelines for narrative structure. Essentially, they wanted insight into every aspect of how the Smithsonian decides what history to tell and how to tell it. Today's deadline, which brings us to today, January 14, 2026. According to a December letter from White House officials, Vince Haley and Russell Vought, this is the deadline for the Smithsonian to submit all remaining documents for review. The Smithsonian did submit some materials in September, but the White House says it fell far short of what was requested. With the overwhelming majority of items still outstanding, the stakes couldn't be higher. The December letter makes it explicit. Federal funds for the Smithsonian's billion-dollar budget are only available for use in a manner consistent with Executive Order 14253, in other words, comply or lose your funding. The letter adds a sense of urgency by connecting this review to next year's celebration of America's 250th birthday. The White House wants assurance that none of the Smithsonian's leadership is confused about the fact that the United States has been among the greatest forces for good in the history of the world. The American people, they wrote, will have no patience for any museum that is diffident about America's founding or uncomfortable conveying a positive view of American history. Museum ethics experts have called this timeline nearly impossible to meet. Smithsonian exhibits typically take 2 to 3 years of planning and involve collecting input from groups of scholars and experts in audio and visual displays. One expert told reporters that nobody could provide these kinds of materials in such a comprehensive way, in such a short amount of time, calling it an impossible task. The process has reportedly been slowed by 2 factors: the longest federal government shutdown in U.S. history, and what the White House calls ongoing staffing transitions at the Smithsonian. The broader implications. This isn't happening in isolation. The dispute raises fundamental questions about government overreach and institutional independence. Legal scholars point out that while the Smithsonian receives federal funding, it's not technically an executive branch agency. Court rulings have consistently affirmed its unique legal status as independent from executive control. The Congressional Research Service published an analysis suggesting that most of the actions proposed in the executive order don't appear to rest solely in the vice president's authority as a regent. The Board of Regents has authorities granted by Congress that allow for no other restrictions than those enacted in law, potentially creating a constitutional standoff. There's also significant public disagreement about this intervention. According to a Quinnipiac University poll from August, overall 6 in 10 Americans oppose the review efforts. However, the numbers break sharply along political lines, with almost 70% of Republicans supporting the review. Some artists and staff members have already reported a chilling effect. A poet said some of her work about racial justice was cut from a reading at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in May, with event organizers telling her the institution was being very cautious due to increased scrutiny from the White House. Meanwhile, a grassroots effort called Citizen Historians for the Smithsonian has mobilized over 600 volunteers to photograph and document current exhibits across all Smithsonian museums. The goal is to create a before and after record in case exhibits are removed or altered, preserving what's currently on display for future reference. Professional organizations have pushed back strongly. The American Historical Association released a statement saying the executive order egregiously misrepresents the work of the Smithsonian and completely misconstrues the nature of historical work. They emphasize that historians explore the past to understand how our nation has evolved, not to criticize or celebrate, but to understand what happens next. So what happens after today's deadline? The Smithsonian has declined to comment publicly on the matter, maintaining its position that it's conducting its own review to ensure programming is nonpartisan and factual. Secretary Lonnie Bunch has reportedly been walking a fine line between maintaining a cordial working relationship with the White House and defending the institution's independence. If the Smithsonian doesn't comply fully, the White House could theoretically attempt to withhold federal funding. However, that funding is controlled by Congress through appropriations, not by the executive branch directly. The Office of Management and Budget controls the disbursement of those funds, giving the administration some leverage. But any actual withholding would likely face legal challenges and congressional pushback. There's also the question of what content corrections would actually look like. The White House letter mentions that within 120 days, museums should begin replacing what they call divisive or ideologically driven language with unifying, historically accurate and constructive descriptions across placards, wall text, digital displays, and other public-facing materials. But who decides what's divisive versus accurate? What's ideological versus factual? These are the questions at the heart of this dispute. Is acknowledging the full scope of American history, including slavery and racial injustice, divisive, or is it simply accurate? Is celebrating American achievements while also confronting difficult chapters propaganda, or is it honest scholarship? This deadline represents more than just an administrative dispute between two government entities. It's fundamentally about who controls America's historical narrative at a time when we're approaching the nation's 250th anniversary. On one side, the administration argues it's protecting American greatness from what it sees as ideological distortion. They believe museums should inspire pride and celebrate achievement, not dwell on difficult aspects of the past or divide Americans along racial lines. On the other side, historians, museum professionals, and many in the public argue that honest history must include both triumphs and tragedies. They contend that understanding the full complexity of America's past, including systemic racism and other difficult topics, isn't anti-American but essential to a functioning democracy. What makes this particularly significant is the precedent it sets. Never before has a White House conducted this kind of comprehensive ideological review of the Smithsonian's content. The institution has weathered controversies before, like the 1990s dispute over the Enola Gay exhibit, or the 2020 controversy over a display about white dominant culture that was later removed. But those were resolved through scholarly debate and internal review, not executive orders threatening funding. As we watch what happens in the coming days and weeks, we're witnessing a test of American institutional independence. Can our cultural institutions maintain their integrity when faced with political pressure? Can they present history honestly, even when that history makes people uncomfortable? And ultimately, in a democracy, who should decide how we remember our past? The Smithsonian has stood for 179 years as a place where Americans can encounter their history in all its complexity. Today's deadline will help determine whether it can continue to do so independently. Whatever your perspective on this issue, one thing is certain: the outcome will have implications far beyond museum walls, touching on fundamental questions about truth, power, and the role of history in American democracy.